honestly, the only way I can get these
It's
out.
9:59. We can't give them an extra minute of teaching. But,
Whoa, I better nails than I do.
She is a crack.
Whoa, shit.
Should be good.
Oh, that's okay.
All right, good morning. We're getting started here. We are, I'll let you guys know in just a sec. We're still in Daniel. So we've got a number of people out right now because they are actually in Pastor's new members class right now. So that if it looks a little more empty in here. Although actually, for the time we start, this isn't bad. Usually we double gradually as people actually start making it to church. But I'm glad to see everybody here today. We are still in the book of Daniel. So if you want to go ahead and go to Daniel chapter 10. Daniel chapter 10. And I'll be honest with you. When I started teaching, when I was starting to think about because we were going through the book of James, and when I started getting to the end of that, I was thinking to myself, now, what do I want to talk about next? And when the idea of Daniel came up, my one hesitation to do that was these last three chapters. Because they're a little bit harder to make deeply thrilling. The first 6 chapters are stories. Many of them are stories that if you grew up in church, you've known since childhood. And then there's a couple visions that he has that even if nobody else finds interesting, I find interesting because they have a lot to do with how the Bible prophecy fits into history and how we know things went. And in some ways, that's what we're going to continue to talk about in these last chapters, except it's going to get a lot more detailed and therefore a little bit more difficult to make, to make, I don't want to say make interesting, but to make relevant, okay? Because what a lot of people want from church, chapter 10, Daniel chapter 10, what a lot of people want from church is they want deeply relevant things to their lives. And I get that. When we know the Bible, we want to know how is this useful. I think that's what we want in any kind of thing that we learn, right? When I teach in our high school, a lot of times what I hear is when am I ever going to use this in life? Because people want to believe what they're going to have is useful. I hear that a lot. What I've also heard people say is after they graduate is, the good thing about having a church here is we have people who sometimes continue to stick around after they graduate. Hi, Charles. Yeah, I see you back there. I've heard a couple people say, "Man, I wished they taught me blank in school." And I'm like, they did. I was there. You were taught that. Okay. The thing is that things on the surface might not seem useful. But if you look into it deeply, we understand that the reason that God has the things that he has in his word is he does have a reason for it. And so every part of the Bible is important. Every part of the Bible is important to understand deeply. And so we're going to look at these last several chapters of Daniel. Now, not all of them today, but starting. These last 3 chapters, chapter 10, 11, and 12, should be read as one unit, okay? Remember that whenever you read the Bible, outside of probably Psalms, remember that the chapters of the Bible were added later. The Bible existed even in book form like this for a little, for a little while, for hundreds of years, without any chapters and verse divisions. Again, with the exception of Psalms, where they are individual psalms. And so I like the chapters and verses. I'm glad those were put in there. They're very helpful and they're very useful to, because it was nice to be able to say, hey, turn to chapter 10, rather than try to find some way to explain on where to turn it. But what it does mean is that sometimes the chapters and verse divisions are a little bit questionable. Or sometimes people felt like that they have to divide very long thoughts by not making the chapters too long. And that's probably what happened here. These last 3 chapters are basically one unit, but they didn't want this like super long chapter at the end. So what we'll do is we'll go through it, but remember it's all one long thing. Chapter 10 in many ways is an introduction to what's going to be talked about in chapters 10 and 11. Okay? So just to remember the context of Daniel, remember that Daniel is an exile into Babylon, Persia. And I say Babylon, Persia because remember, he became a exile taken from Judah when he was very young. He lives most of his life there in the Babylonian Empire. Eventually the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Persians. In both cases, both the Babylonians and the Persians seem to really enjoy having Daniel be part of their government. He is a wise man. And we see a number of stories that put Daniel in somewhat difficult scenarios as he is trying to live in this foreign land, but also live out his faith at the same time, something I think that's very relevant to us as, at least I think in probably everyone here's lifetime, we have seen a gradual de-Christianization of our society. And so understanding how to live in a world that does not share our values, does not share our outlook is very important. But Daniel also had a look to the future. The idea that God has a plan and that the conquering of Judah by the Babylonians was not a sign that God had failed. It was not a sign that God had abandoned his plan. And what the people in Daniel's day needed to see is that God still was in charge, was still in control, and he still had a plan that he was working out. And so many of Daniel's prophecies are about God's ultimate plan. Now, remember, to the people who read them at the time, they would be the future for them. And so what they're going to have to do is trust that what God says is going to happen is really going to happen. That God really does have this plan. Now, we are on the other side of it. Okay? To us, what Daniel talks about is mostly already happened. Okay? I say mostly because we get into chapter 12, there's some stuff there that probably hasn't happened yet. But most of it's already happened. So what does it mean for us? What it shows for us is that we can actually look and see what Daniel said was going to happen. And then we can look at historical records. And if they match, we understand that, hey, God knew what he was talking about. God really was in control. God really does have a plan. And of course, if God had a plan back then we can be assured that God has a plan now that he's still working out. And that just like what he said would happen then, the things that have not yet happened, we can trust that those are going to happen. What we also see is when we see what has happened, what Daniel foretold, what happened, we also see the meaning of it. Because everything that we see even today, God has a plan and a reason for it, but we don't always know why he's doing it. And so what these prophecies do is they give us a little bit of an insight into how God works and what he's doing. So having said that, we're going to start a new vision today. I will go ahead and remind us of basically the visions that Daniel has had before, because I do think that's kind of relevant. So most of Daniel's visions have focused on the fact that God has this timeline, and in these initial visions, and most of them, he does not give dates. Of course, the dates that we use today didn't exist back in those days. You understand, like BC and AD, that was something that was created later. But he doesn't give, what he gives is he gives a timeline in ruling empires. So he says, okay, there's going to be these 4 empires, and then is going to come the victory of God and the coming of the kingdom of God. And he tells this in different ways. There's a statue made out of various different metals that ends up getting crushed by a big boulder, and it says those 4 metals are the 4 kingdoms, and the boulder is the kingdom of God. He talked about 4 beasts and again, those 4 beasts represented those same empires, and we understand those to be Babylon, Persia, Greece, and the Romans. He had one other vision of these 2 animals. One is a goat and one is a ram that zoomed in on Empire 2 and 3. That would be Persia and Greece. One thing for us that's important about the days of Persia and Greece is that takes place mostly in between the New Testaments. Okay? If you know your Bible well, okay, you may be very familiar with the Old Testament. You may be very familiar with what happens in the New Testament. But one of the things you have to keep in mind is that there are several hundred years in between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. Okay? And so God is still working in that era as well. And much of what what Daniel is going to talk about in these set of passages is things that happen in that middle period. And so they might be things that you're not as aware of. So, chapter 10 and verse 1 sets the setting. It says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar, and the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. This is the introduction. Yes?
Where are we on? Sorry.
Chapter 10, verse 1. Yeah. So he's going to go ahead and give you the context for these last 3 chapters. Okay. Now he has it in this vision in the 3rd year of King Cyrus. So that puts it at the beginning of the Persian period. Cyrus the Great, very well-known Persian king. He conquered the Babylonians. He is the one who initially allowed the first people to go back, and Jews to go back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. You can read about that in the book of Ezra if you want to. But this also places Daniel as a fairly old man. Okay, so he is in his 80s. This is in the general same time frame that Daniel in the lion's den happens. Remember I said when we went over that while Daniel's oftentimes pictured as a very young man in that story, they actually threw like an old man into a den of lions and to see if they would eat him. Now he says that that something was revealed to him. A word was revealed to him. In other words, a message was revealed, and that this word is true, and it involves great conflict. Okay, so there's going to be some difficult stuff that's going to be talked about here. Remember that God's plan is not always as smooth as we would like it. Okay? We like to think of the Christian life as things maybe having a few bumps along the road, but it all kind of works out okay. Okay? I always think of this as like 1970s sitcoms, right? Where you have a small problem, but you know by the end of the 30 minutes, it's all going to be okay at the end. Okay? There is no story arc that lasts for multiple episodes. You know the problem's going to be small, it's going to be short, and everything's going to be okay. And we like to think of the Christian life as like that. Except that Daniel's prophecy here, he says it's true, but he says it's going to be involve great conflict, and it is going to be, as we will see, a very long-term unfolding thing. And that's very easy for us to say because we're looking, 2,000 plus years later. But for the people going through that great conflict, this is difficult things. And they have to be able to trust that God knows what he is doing and has a plan and is able to bring that plan and to its desired conclusion. And he says, Daniel says, at the end of the day, I understand the vision. Now, that's not always true. Remember, there are other visions that Daniel's had. He's like, God, I don't know what's happening here. Okay? But by the end of it, he's going to understand, and he's now going to communicate that to us. Because at the end of the book, in his last writings, he wants us to know what God's ultimate plan is. Let's go ahead and look at it here. Verse 2. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for three weeks. I ate no delicacies. No meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for all the full 3 weeks. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris. Let me stop there for a second. So he's by the Tigris River, which is a very famous river in that part of the world. And it says that he has been praying for 3 weeks. Now, this is going to become important later, that this has been a 3-week-long thing. And it says that he has been mourning, and he's been doing things that involve that he is like fasting. He is not, it says that he's not allowing himself to eat any delicacies. So in other words, he's eating the bare minimum to survive. Because he is not right now wanting to focus on physical things. There is something that is deeply bothering him, and he is mourning over it. And, you know, we live in America, and we have lots of food here. And we like our food, don't we? And in many ways, it might sound crazy, like who would purposely not eat good food, right? But when you're really upset, you have no appetite. You know, when you are in deep mourning, like you're not saying, hey, let's go get ice cream. Like you are not eating anything, and if you are, it's just a little here and there to survive. And some of you, you've been through various things, and you know what I'm talking about. And so Daniel's in deep mourning. Now, it does not say what he's in mourning about. What I gather, well, this is before the vision. The vision's going to come at the end of the 3 weeks that he's been praying. My guess is, since as we look at the vision and you look at the context of the whole book of Daniel, I think he is mourning about something about his people. Something about the people of Israel and their return to Jerusalem. It was not an easy thing. Like when they went there, it was a long trip. There were lots of people who wanted to see the temple not rebuilt. There was lots of struggle there. And so I suspect it had something to do with that. He's an old man. He's not looking to make the trip, but he wants to see it succeed. And he is in deep mourning because of its problems and its struggles, is kind of where I'm reading in between the lines here. But then after these 3 weeks, it says in verse 5, it says, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in a deep sleep, with my face to the ground. So at the end of these 3 weeks, he has this vision, and he has this vision of this man. And it says that it describes him a little bit. It says he has the appearance of lightning. His eyes have like flaming torches. His legs are like bronze. And it says his sound was like the sound of a multitude. So like loud and echoey is the way that I read it. Who is this person that Daniel is seeing? There is a little bit of debate about this within Christians. Some people believe this is an angel. like a high-ranking high angel. Some people believe that this is a pre-incarnate vision of Jesus Christ. Now, I'll tell you which one I think it is. I think it's a vision of Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, Jesus, of course, has not been born yet. The Bethlehem and the baby and the shepherds and the wise men and all that stuff. That has not happened yet. But let's think about this for a second. Did Jesus begin with the conception in Mary that was done by the Holy Spirit? Okay? If you believe in the Trinity, like our church does, like all true churches do, I would say, okay, then you believe that the Son, God the Son, is eternal like the Father. The Father, the Son, the Spirit, they have always been, they always will be. And so God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, has always existed. Okay? And there are times in the Old Testament that it does seem that he is making an appearance to people. Now, the reason I think that this in particular is a vision of Jesus is because if you read the very beginning of the book of Revelation chapter 1, another book, that is very interested in God's plan for how things are going to turn out. John has a vision of someone that is clearly Jesus, and you will find that the descriptions of them are very similar. And so what happens is when John is writing that in the book of Revelation, you are supposed to think, oh, that's the vision from Daniel. Okay, you're supposed to connect the two. And so, anyway, but it says, and the reaction that there are four, if you include Daniel here, in the Bible who have great visions of God in his glory. You've got Ezekiel, you've got Isaiah, you've got John. And they all kind of have this same reaction, and then you have Daniel here, I believe, and they all have this same reaction where they are overwhelmed. They are overwhelmed by their sin, they are terrified. I mean, the majesty and power and awe of God is there. And he says, the appearance of me looked fearful. I was terrified. He says, I have no strength. And he says, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground. I'm going to assume this means that he passed out. I don't think he took a nap. Okay? Some of you are like, well, that's my answer to everything, so maybe he did. But I think he just collapsed here. He is just overwhelmed by what's going on. And in verse 10 it says, and behold, a hand touched me, and set my trembling on my hands and knees. And I'll tell you, he says he feels someone tired. And this is one of the reasons it becomes confusing about who is who, because it doesn't say if there's a lot of he's in different people in this, and a lot of times it doesn't say who is who. So is this person touching him the same as this great vision that he's seen, or is it someone else? That's why there's kind of a debate upon who this is. But I think this is a different being. There's several angels that are going to be mentioned here. Some people think this one right here is Gabriel, that's already been mentioned twice, but it does not say that, so we can't say that for sure. But anyway, so an angel says touched him, and it says verse 11, it says, and he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you, and stand upright. For now I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, fear not, Daniel. For from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. Now this is interesting. Okay? Well, this one here is an angel. Okay? And he says, I have been, God has heard your words from the very first part of the 3 weeks. Now, this is important because I think this affects how we think of prayer sometimes. Because a lot of times when we don't get what we want right away, or we don't get an answer, or peace, or something right away, we think, God, why aren't you listening? Daniel's been praying for 3 weeks, and not just for a few minutes in the morning, but intensely. Okay? And he says, God has heard you from the very first time you started praying. Yes?
I prayed for over 20 years for my son that touched me and did.
There you go. Yeah.
Every day.
Right, and I'm sure that from the very first prayer, God heard you, right? And now the question, of course, is why? Why? If the angel was going to come to him and speak to him in response to his prayers, why didn't he just come right away? Now, this is going to get interesting because what this is going to do is it's going to open the veil a little bit and allow us to see what's going on spiritually behind the scenes. Okay? Because the Bible talks about that we live in a physical world, but there is a spiritual reality. Okay? There are angels. There are evil spirits, demons, okay, that exist. There is a real devil. Okay? There's a lot of people in our society who, for some reason, I don't know why they don't understand why this is a kind of a contradiction, they have no problem believing in God. They'll say, oh yeah, I believe in God. But then you start getting into Satan or demons or angels, and all of a sudden they're like, I don't believe in that mystical stuff. It's like, well, you understand God would also be, well, okay, whatever. But we're going to get a little bit of an opening here to kind of see how that spiritual world looks like. Because the truth is, we don't know everything that we might want to ask about that world. And the thing about that is that's okay. God tells us what we need to know. He says, verse 12 says, then he said to me, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. For I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision is for days yet to come. So he says, look, for these last 21 days, that would be 3 weeks for those of you who aren't great at math. Okay? So the whole time he's been praying. He says, I'll show you later. I'll write that for you, Rob, okay? He says that the prince of Persia withstood me 21 days. Okay? Now the question is, who is the prince of Persia here? Okay? Now, if you're going to read this super literally, you might be like, oh, it's the king of Persia, it's Cyrus. Is Cyrus here fighting an angel that's trying to answer a prayer? That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Or if you're going to say, well, it doesn't say king, it says prince. I don't think this is Cyrus' son either. That makes even less sense. So what most people think is that the prince of Persia here is a spiritual being. Okay? And in this case, we see that this is an evil spiritual being that apparently has a lot of influence specifically on the kingdom of Persia. We will see a few more of such beings mentioned in this chapter. And what we see is that there are spiritual entities affecting the reality and world that we live in ways that we don't understand. Okay? Now, I was talking before about making this stuff relevant today. Is Persia in the news very much today? Yes. Persia, the part of the world that was called Persia back in those days, today we would call Iran. Okay? Is this same entity at work in a major way today? Could be. I don't think demons retire. Okay, so maybe. All right. But he says he withstood it. So in other words, the reason the Daniel's prayer, it says that he was praying for understanding. And he said in verse 14, he says, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. That's why I thought that the morning was about what would happen to Israel, to the people of Judah. He says, I wanted to come answer you, but I was withstood for 3 weeks. And then he says, but he says in verse 13, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. Okay? This is one reason we know that this angel here is not Jesus, because Jesus would not need help from another spiritual entity. Okay? So, original vision, probably a vision of Christ, a pre-incarnate vision of Christ. The second person, this is a different person, this angel that touched him, says, look, I've been coming here to give you the understanding you need, but I have been withstood for these 3 weeks. Look, guys, the demon world is real. Okay? Now, what we cannot do, there's a couple ways that we should, there's a way we should react to this, and there's a couple ways we should not react to this, okay? Number one, we should not live in fear, okay? The reality that there are evil spiritual entities, and that there are evil spiritual entities that want to cause us harm, and that want to influence us on an individual level, like the people like you see Jesus casting out demons, and on the big world stage, like in various empires and the moving of things around the world. That's real, but understand that God is in charge of those too. Okay? What was the response of the demons when Jesus spoke to them? They were afraid of Christ, and they had to ultimately obey him. Okay? They are a part of God's plan. In the same way that any evil individual human being is, they don't take God by surprise. They cannot thwart God's plans. Neither can these evil spiritual entities. So we should not live in constant fear. Number two, I don't think we should be overly fascinated by this. Okay? We should be aware of what the Bible says about it, but it's not something that we need to be always looking into, always thinking about. We certainly shouldn't be, conducting seances or using Ouija boards or anything like that. That type of thing is strictly forbidden in the Old Testament. God did not want his people involved in that. The third thing I would say is when you're thinking about this stuff and realize that it's real, please do not use Hollywood's version of these things to define what you believe about them. Okay? There's all kinds of, in TVs and movies and books, there's all kinds of things about like spirits and demons and witches and things like that. And most of that you see in these movies and stuff is complete fantasy. It has nothing to do with reality. It has nothing to do with the way that the Bible describes that stuff. So we can kind of put, at least I would say, put those in completely different categories, okay? The way we should react to this is we should not dismiss it, though, having said all that other stuff. We should be aware that it's there and understand that in our prayer life and in our lives and in the world, there are spiritual entities out there. And if you read Ephesians chapter 6, when it's talking about the armor of God, it says those are our real enemies. Our enemies might look like the people who hate Christ and are trying to promote things opposite of Christ or persecute Christians or whatever. We might look at those flesh and blood human beings that do that and think that those are our enemies. But remember, those people have been deceived. And those ideas and movements have demonic forces behind them. Okay, and we need to be aware of that. We need to not be naive that those things are real. The Bible declares them to be real, and that can be hard in our society because we have a very naturalistic worldview, and where we are taught to just dismiss those types of things out of hand. And I'm not saying we should be naive and believe every ghost story or something like that we hear, but at the same time we need to be aware that these things are real and not just dismiss them out of hand just because our culture trains us to think in that way. And so what we're trying to do here, if nothing else, Daniel here is giving us a biblical worldview of life in the spirit world. And he says, okay, what the vision that he's about to give them are for the days to come. Okay? So again, Daniel, very interested in the future, or more specifically, God's very interested in revealing the future to him. Verse 15. When he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face toward the ground and was mute. We see over and over again that Daniel continues to be overwhelmed. Even once he wakes up from passing out, it still talks about him shaking. It still talks about him being weak. He is still very overwhelmed by all that he's experiencing, and so would you. If you notice, whenever angels are in the Bible, a lot of times when they appear to people, what do they say? Fear not. You know why they're saying fear not? Because the people are afraid that they're talking to. Okay? And so, and before we judge them too fast, we would be too, probably. Okay? But anyway, verse 16 says, and behold, one in the likeness of the children of man touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spoke. And I said to him who spoke before me, O my Lord, by reason of the visions, pains have come upon me, and I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servant talk with my Lord? For now no strength remains in me, and no breath is in me. Okay, again, very overwhelmed. Verse 18. Again, one having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me. And he said, O man greatly loved, fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage. And he spoke to me, and as he spoke to me, I was strengthened and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. Then he said, Do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side except Michael, your prince. Okay? Now, this Michael, remember, was also mentioned in verse 13, where the angel said, I was looking to come, but the prince of Persia was fighting me. He says, but Michael came to my rescue. Okay? So here's kind of how I'm interpreting all this. Here's what the angel is saying. First of all, of course, the angel has to strengthen Daniel. Okay? And tells Daniel to have courage. And look, we need strengthening from God and from God's ministering spirits. Okay? We do not have the ability to deal with things on our own. We constantly need the strength and guidance and courage from God. The angel says that, do you know why I've come to you? He says, when I leave you, I'm once again going to be in battle, spiritual battle here, with the prince of Persia, that entity, that spiritual being that's leading Persia. But then he also says, then the prince of Greece will come. Okay, so we now have this other spiritual entity that he is going to have to fight. Now, this also calls back to Daniel's visions. Okay, the second empire that would rule was who? Persia. who would then eventually be conquered by the Greeks. And so Daniel's anticipating this happening. He says, but before I do that, he says, I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. Okay? The book of truth. Before I talk about the book of truth, though, I want to mention the fact that it also mentions that Michael will be with them, and then he says, your prince. I take that to be, this is a spiritual entity. Because remember, this whole prophecy is about what will happen to Daniel's people. I take this to be the spiritual entity that is in charge of Israel. But this is a good spiritual entity. This is Michael. Okay? There's only 2 angels given names in the Bible, and both of them are named here in the book of Daniel. We've seen Gabriel, that was mentioned before. He's mentioned twice in 2 different stories here. And Daniel, of course, is mentioned again in the New Testament, proclaiming the birth of John the Baptist and then of Jesus himself. Michael here is this other angel that's mentioned, and he is mentioned again, I believe, in the book of Revelation. And so, and by the way, if you want to understand the book of Revelation, and a lot of people have different mentalities. Some people say, that's a weird book, I want to stay far away from that as I can. Other people, it's like, you just got saved and that's the first place you want to look, right? Might I say, every book of the Bible is good to study and read. Might I say, though, that before you look at the book of Revelation, know the rest of your Bible very well. And especially the book of Daniel. Okay? If Revelation is the first book that you read, you will have no idea what is happening. I mean, if it's the last book that you read, you might have no idea what's happening either. But you certainly will, because there's a lot of callbacks and allusions to other parts of the Bible. And if you don't know the other parts of the Bible, especially Daniel, if you remember that there's this beast, this monster kind of thing that appears in a vision in Daniel, or in Revelation, and we said that we looked at that when we looked at the 4 beasts that Daniel saw, and we said that that monster in Revelation has all these weird characteristics. They're a combination of the 4 beasts of Daniel, all putting them all together. Okay? If you don't know the book of Daniel, you don't know that. Okay? And so this has a great connection to that particular book of the Bible. So it's going to be this angel here, we don't know who it is, with Michael, engaging in spiritual warfare against the prince of Persia, I guess you could say the demon or whatever that's in charge of Persia, and then later on, the one that is in charge of Greece. Having said that, though, this angel is going to reveal to Daniel what is going to happen to his people. Okay? And he calls Michael your prince, and that's why I'm making that connection between Michael and Israel. And he says, I'm going to tell you what's written in the book of truth. Now, there's no explanation here for what the book of truth is, but I think we can kind of read between the lines here and understand what this is. This is God's declared plan for what he is going to do. The angel has already said, I'm going to reveal what will happen to your people in the latter days. Now that doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world, like the end of time, but it does mean time beyond now when he and Daniel were speaking. And it's called the book of truth because God has declared everything that will happen. And everything that God has declared, or that is, if you want to say, part of God's plan, however you want to say it, it will happen. That is why we can call it a book of truth. Okay? If you go to a used bookstore, you can find books about politics and stuff from 20 years ago and find all of the stuff that they predicted would happen. And the reason it's a used bookstore is because most people sold those books because everything that people thought was going to happen did not happen. Because there's things that human beings could not anticipate. Could you imagine telling someone in the 90s that Donald Trump was going to be president? Okay, nobody would have believed that. Okay, that was before that too. But that's because human beings don't know the future, and there's no looks at the future that anything that a human writes that could be called the book of truth. It'd be called the book of guesses that like 90-some% is going to be wrong. Okay, but everything that God, if we get anything from this introduction, because when you get into the next chapter that we'll start talking about next week, you get into what Daniel actually says, or what the angel tells Daniel is about to happen. But the thing that we need to get from this introduction here is that God is sovereign, and he is in charge of all things. There are spiritual entities fighting against him, but ultimately, those are a part of his plan as well. Okay? Why? It's kind of, this is not a perfect analogy, but if someone's writing a book or a story, they're going to put villains in the story, are they not? Why are those villains in the story? Because the hero needs someone to defeat and overcome. Okay? And God has allowed villains, evil, in our world. But it's not like a lot of people think, where it's like God and the devil are kind of like neck and neck, and you kind of never know who's going to pull out ahead in the end. Okay? God is completely in charge. Okay? He shows that in the ways that he shows Daniel exactly what's going to happen. We've already seen some of that in the various empires that rule. We'll see that in these next couple chapters. But God is going to win. Okay? Truth is going to win out. Evil is going to be defeated. The people of God will ultimately triumph over the people who follow the wicked one. And we, I think, need that encouragement for the same reasons that the people of Daniel's day did. Because in Daniel's day, they looked and saw that, as they thought of it, the people of God were Judah and Israel. They had been conquered by Babylon, who we see here is controlled by evil spirits behind the scenes. They are going to, spoiler alert, going to be conquered by the Greeks as well, who also have this demonic influence behind it. And they could easily look around and say, man, where is God? It does not look like we're going to win from what's going on right now. Okay? Remember, first of all, you never turn off the game at halftime. Okay? Number two, God's already said and showed us what's going to happen. He's going to win. He's going to be victorious. And that is why we should trust in him, follow him, even now, even when it doesn't necessarily look like he knows what's going on. He was right in Daniel's day, and he's right today. Let's follow him and be faithful to him and trust in him that his plan that he has had in this book from the beginning of time is going exactly how it is. Let's pray. Oh, Lord, we thank you for your